Welcome everybody to the first day of FairCon. It is today, October 6th, and we have a great session called Use Case Panorama, How Fair Analysts Improves Risk Communications and Decision Making. And our panelists today are going to be sharing their stories and use cases. We have Kurt Zanzi and we have Hans Schwarz. The way this is going to work is I'm going to turn the presentation over to Kurt. He's going to tell us about how he's used FAIR, and then we'll turn it over to Hans. I invite you, please, to put your questions in the chat. We are going to be doing live, chat response so just if you see something in the presentation that you have a question about, just jump right in there. Again, my name is Donna Gallaher, and I am from Atlanta, Georgia. I'm a member of the FAIR Board of Advisors and the president of the Atlanta FAIR Institute. And I'm a virtual CISO here in Atlanta. And since I've gotten involved with FAIR, it's changed my whole way of thinking. And I hope that the information that you learn at FairCon is going to really improve your service to your organization. With that, let me introduce you to Kurt. I have a little biography here. Kurt is a privacy and information security professional with 18 years of experience. He has served in this capacity with various companies, including EDS, Hewlett-Packard, ACS, and Xerox. And in 2011, he began working in the healthcare sector, where he is today, and he works for a major healthcare organization in California. So, Kurt, welcome, and thank you for your presentation today.
Thank you, Donna.
What you got for us?
Okay, well, thanks, Donna, and welcome, Hans, and everybody else that are viewing this session on FairCon 2020. Virtual this year, but it's been a challenging year, as we all know. I hope as you're viewing this session that you and yours are coping with this challenging year, and you're all safe and healthy and all that stuff. So welcome, and glad to be here. So let me go ahead and share my slide deck, and I'll go ahead and get started. So again, I'm here to talk about what our organization has done in using FAIR to facilitate some decision-making that we've had to take care of during this challenging time. Now, of course, I'm in the healthcare sector, and COVID-19 has had a significant impact on our sector, obviously from taking care of our primary responsibility, which is our patients, but also organizationally, the pandemic has brought a lot of issues to bear and a lot of challenges to bear that we need to handle from a risk perspective. That's what I'm going to talk about today, is how we used FAIR to help facilitate some of the decision-making situations that our directors had to take care of. So I'll go ahead and begin and talk about what went on. So essentially, we as an organization, as a large healthcare organization here in California, we use several vendors to do certain business initiatives or certain things having to do with our patient population, and several of those vendors are offshore. Now, when we bring those vendors on board, we certainly do our due diligence in making sure that the locations that they're providing work from are secure, and their clean rooms, and they're certainly fit for accessing some of our confidential data and things that shouldn't normally be viewed outside of the confines of within the business of Sutter Health. So in the spring of 2020, when we were all kind of thrown under the shelter-in-place orders, not only in the United States, but across the globe, really, one of the things that we really didn't anticipate as an organization was our offshore vendors calling us up and saying, hey, we all need to go home now. We need to change the equation about where we're providing your services. And that meant a lot of different employees all of a sudden now not being able to go to their office and having to go work from locations that we really had no idea the security of those locations. These were homes, okay? These were places where these individuals lived. And certainly we couldn't vet the physical security or environmental security of these locations like we would any normal data center, okay? And so our leadership was faced with this situation where they had to decide really, whether or not they want to continue these business objectives while the shelter-in-place orders were going on, or pause these business initiatives during the shelter-in-place, which would, of course, have financial ramifications. So they came to us and basically said, help us, understand the risk revolving around all these offshore vendors now sending their employees home. What does that risk look like to us as an organization as far as accessing our data from various locations? Like I said, typically homes. So what we decided to do is, we decided to go ahead and quantify these types of situations using the FAIR method to be able to communicate back to the director levels what this risk looks like from a financial perspective. What are some loss magnitudes that we could be facing if something happens? So when we're talking about this and we're trying to come up with a scenario or some scoping statements, what we usually try to do with our leadership is we would go back to them and say, okay, we understand you want to try to understand the risk around this, but what is the bad thing you're worried about? What is the thing that keeps you up at night regarding this situation? And for a healthcare organization, it really is an unauthorized disclosure of confidential information, right? We do not want our business information or our patient population certainly being disclosed in an unauthorized manner, which could cause harm to patients, in various ways. So that's the bad thing they kind of described to us. And so what we had to do is we had to come up with a situation or a scoping statement to wrap our heads around that. And so essentially what we're looking at here is, if you can see on the other part of my slide, is the asset that we were dealing with here in a situation where, various data stores that contain confidential information. The threat in this case was a privileged insider, because after all, these are vendors of ours, and they do have a business justification for looking at this data and processing this kind of data. So the threat we decided would be a privileged insider, and the effect obviously is confidentiality. This is 99% of our effects when we're doing the FAIR analysis on our business objectives. And the forms of loss we came up with is obviously a response to a cyber incident or some sort of unauthorized disclosure. Fines and judgments, obviously, if you're dealing with health information, that's an obvious thing that we're going to have to deal with. And reputation, of course. Nobody wants to see their name in headlines in the papers for a massive data breach, especially in the healthcare sector. Your reputation can be badly damaged based upon that. So once we got that settled, once we got our scenarios and our scoping statements all together, obviously at this time it's about the data, right? You want to make sure you're using data that's going to give you the most accurate type of outcomes that you want. And I understand that this is a big issue for all of us when we're using the FAIR model, is that where do we get the data? What can we do to make sure that the values we're using in the FAIR model are going to give our leadership the best representation of the magnitude of losses and the threat events that they're facing? So as a healthcare organization, unauthorized disclosures are a fact of life. I mean, they happen. A lot happen from insider type situations, whether malicious or errors or whatnot. So unauthorized disclosures are a big deal. So we had some internal data that we were able to use for our loss event frequency numbers. But I also wanted to put a pitch out there for the industry sources, primarily the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report. I would recommend this. I reference it all the time. The Data Breach Investigation Report will give you things like frequency, will give you things like threat events. It has a separate section for the healthcare sector. There's also different various sectors in there. And I was able to reference this and see how many privileged insiders caused unauthorized data disclosures in the health industry in 2019. Okay, and so that gives me a good idea of the type of frequency of loss events that healthcare organizations are dealing with when it comes to this. okay? And so there's others as well. Obviously, when you're looking at as far as records and the values of records, you can look at the Ponymon reports, and also I also referenced the Scientia Iris 2020 report. Just using those to inform my decision making and inform my values that I want to go ahead and put into my FAIR analysis. Now, for the other side of the model, the right-hand side of the model, the loss magnitude side of things, for our primary loss situations, I'm interviewing internal teams, right? I think that it's very, very important that you get on the first name basis with at least one or two individuals in these various teams within your organization. With interviews with our cybersecurity teams, our threat teams, our regulatory teams, obviously for a response cost situation, I want to know from the cyber folks how long it takes for them to, formalize a response to a cyber incident, and what's that going to take on their team's effort to go ahead and investigate and, come up with some resolutions around the event. Regulatory for me helps me with loss values, fines and judgments, things like that. Very important that you maintain contact with these folks, and again, get on a first name basis with a few of them, because you're going to be talking to them quite a bit. For the secondary loss things, again, kind of a similar thing. So the secondary loss magnitude usually for healthcare organizations and records and things like that, the secondary loss frequency is almost always going to be 100%, because there's always going to be some secondary loss there when you're dealing with patient records or business information, because it impacts our patient population. So that's really always going to be 100% for us. Okay, so I got all my numbers. I got all my data that I need. I ran it through Risk Lens. I've done my FAIR analysis, and now it's time to communicate this thing or this report up to the director so they can make a decision. When our organization got into the COVID mode, we started our emergency management system process, which essentially was a 24/7 process that directors man, essentially. So if anything with COVID related was happening within our organization, those all get filtered up to this emergency management system. It's staffed by directors, and they can make decisions about things that are brought in front of them. So what this essentially meant for me was that I would go ahead and process this through the FAIR model through Risk Lens. I would attach it to an email, and this is obviously a dummied up email, but this is what I would add. I would simply say my scope statement, my asset threat and effect values, my forms of loss that I was dealing with, and a brief scenario description, so that they could get a quick, 5 minute type reaction to what I was trying to, relay to them as far as the loss magnitudes for this risk. And I just put a basic paragraph here. 80% probability the loss magnitude would be X, whatever. And if there were some controls that was going to mitigate that risk, I would go ahead and outline them down here. So this helped them facilitate their decision making as far as whether or not these types of businesses or these business arrangements would continue, and whether or not the loss values that I was presenting fell into our loss appetite. Okay, so essentially that's it. So Donna, I'll throw it back to you.
Well, thank you, Kurt. It's some really great food for thought there. I actually had a few questions myself, I think, before we maybe turn over to Hans. So what was the state of your FAIR program before the lockdown?
It was, I would say it was in the infant stages. We really started using FAIR model last year, 2019. And we were trying to get it integrated into our risk management program. So we wanted to make the move to quantification, and we were starting to make those moves into quantification of risk. But COVID really gave us the opportunity to really put it into action and really get some risk decision making information in front of the director levels of our organization. So it really gave it visibility. It really let our director levels know that this is how we want to go ahead and process risk in the future. We want to go quantification on everything. So this was a good opportunity for us to sell it and really show some data-based information they could have that just wasn't picking things out of the sky, high, low, medium, whatever. This was data centric. This was thought about and processed in this way. So it was a good opportunity for us.
Great. Yeah. The other question I had as you were speaking was, I've heard some people say that they've kind of struggled, dissecting the elephant and breaking it down, and that grouping things together that were similar kind of helped them move along. Did you have any groups, like when you were saying you had certain third parties that were accessing a certain asset? Did you group all those together, or can you describe a little bit maybe about how or what assumptions you made as you were kind of breaking down your scenarios?
Yeah, so we kind of diced them up and we separated them. So if we had a certain vendor that was doing a certain business process for a certain part of our healthcare organization, we knew what data was involved there. And we knew, like the number of records and how they were getting access to the data. So I actually, I probably did about a dozen of these types of FAIR assessments for these things that were escalated up through our emergency management system. So these would pop up over the course, I would say about 6 weeks. I did like a dozen of these. And so we didn't just group all of our vendors together and do that. No, the directors wanted to know specifically what was the loss magnitude, potential loss magnitude for this particular scenario, which was an unauthorized disclosure from a privileged insider. So we handled it that way.
Okay. Well, thank you. I want to get to Hans's stories. It sounds like he's got something for us as well. So let me introduce you to Hans Schwarz. He was a senior manager with the cyber risk and compliance team at Ascena Retail Group. He has 15 years of experience in risk, compliance, audit, governance, and information security. His experience includes building and executing risk and audit programs, managing regulatory compliance, security reviews, and regulatory compliance with data privacy laws. And he is currently responsible for the development and implementation of the IT risk program and management of the compliance and third-party risk management groups at his organization. He holds a degree in systems engineering from the University of Lima, Peru, and he holds CISA and CISM certifications from ISACA. So welcome, Hans, and let me turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, Donna, for the introduction. It's a pleasure being here and sharing the space here with Kurt. So let me get started. Let me share my screen. All right. All right, so let me get started directly with our problem statement. So one way we use FAIR at my company is we perform risk analysis during project implementations or proof of concepts when specific security requirements are not being met. Through the risk analysis, we are able to clearly show management if the risk exposure is acceptable or not, and if the investment to meet those requirements is worth the risk reduction. So what I'll do is I'm gonna walk through two specific examples. One of them is we had a project team that committed to deliver a new software implementation to the business without aligning the majority of our security requirements. Through a risk analysis, we proved that that investment was gonna worth the risk reduction. And secondarily, the second example is fast forward 4 to 5 months into that project, and like many projects that do not go the way that they're supposed to, which I'm sure is nothing new for anyone, the database team decided to do a change in the platform direction, which impacted the cost of the implementation on one of the security controls. So we did a second analysis where we show what the risk exposure of not meeting the security requirement was, and how the implementation of that additional control would justify that risk reduction. So let me start putting some background first in regards to the secure zone versus non-secure zone. To bring some context here, to standardize and build a cost-efficient controls, we built a secure zone at my company. Depending on the type of data or interfaces or third-party integrations, it will require for a solution to be or not to be in the secure zone. And this is based on the data classification that we have at our company. So for this particular implementation, which was going to hold PII and was going to have several external interfaces, it needed to be built in the secure zone per our security requirements. So we go ahead and do our risk analysis. First thing we do is the risk statement. And for us, the biggest threat was the malicious external actors, right? It's to identify the threat actor, asset, and impact loss. So what is the biggest threat actor for us is the external malicious actors on our asset, which is the PII in the data warehouse, using malware through phishing or associate surfing webs to malicious websites. Notice that at the end of the day, this is really two scenarios. It's different scenarios, but when we run the analysis through the tool, it's just an aggregate of both analysis. One item that we found beneficial, especially when we talk to management, is putting that risk statement in a graphical form, and showing the attack path. Oh, sorry, it keeps coming up. Not sure why. All right, can control that piece. But the attack path is showing where the issue is, right? It's having the secure that PII financial data, either having it in the secure zone or not having it in the secure zone. So when we do the risk analysis and we start breaking down the loss event frequency, the key aspect here is we broke it down from the threat event frequency and the vulnerability. Why did we pick that path and why didn't we go directly to the loss event frequency? That's because really it's through the controls, whether it's on the secure zone or not in the secure zone, that we can get into that detail and modify and see what the change is. So what I want to do here is, the expectation is, again, not to go through the numbers specifically and challenge the numbers, but more around what is the data in itself, right? So when we talk about the threat event frequency, some of the aspects that we consider was the phishing activity that is going on that we detect through our tools, through our phishing campaigns and the actual click rates through the tools that we have. We can capture what is that click rate on a monthly basis. We also capture, what's the number of employees that we have in our company. And there is also a block ratio there for some of the endpoint protection tools that we have. And through some research, you can talk about the 1% or 2% block ratio. So that's what we use for threat event frequency. The interesting part, like I mentioned, is on the vulnerability, right? What controls do you have or you don't have in place? Just for purposes of illustration and to make sure the PowerPoint doesn't get too full, there's a lot of security controls that are considered in our security standard. I just put some here for purposes of illustration, and some of them are just probably the best known and most common ones, right? So when we talk about a non-secure zone, we do have some endpoint protection today. Our network is relatively flat, and there is some level of database authentication along with some other network authentication portions in our network. When we talk about the controls in the secure zone, right, just to name a few, again, we do have that network segmentation, jump host, logging and monitoring that is supposed to go to the SOC, Encryption needs to be happening at the rest and in transit, and data activity monitoring, just to mention a few. But it is these controls that are going to change your loss event frequency. And finally, when we talk about the loss magnitude, is the team wage hour, the number of records that we actually have in the data warehouse. What is that cost from a monitoring perspective, and the fines and judgments? So we run the analysis, two different analyses, one with the controls and one without the controls. So what you see right now is a presentation actually that we leverage this when we present it to the leadership team, right? And it's first with the non-secure zone, there's a determined amount of loss magnitude per event. And what we have found that the conversation is a little bit easier for us when we really talk about the per event ratio, and we talk about the probability of loss for that specific event and the vulnerability. Right, so if we run the numbers, the most likely per event loss, we not only show what that amount is, but also the big number is like we're 50% vulnerable. And then we put it in contrast with what the controls in the secure zone, and you can clearly show that difference in the event loss magnitude and how that is being reduced. Not only just the loss magnitude, but also it shows that without the secure controls, it's 3 times more probable that there's a loss, and it's 10 times more vulnerable than before. And this is a real quick visual that management automatically understands and can easily understand when then you present, hey, the implementation of the controls is also going to cost C, and it's an easy contrast to say, I would rather spend $50,000 for an X million dollars risk reduction. So that's and for this particular case, I'm sorry, we were able to show and therefore get the necessary investment to move that new development into the secure zone. Second scenario, like I say, is fast forward 4 to 5 months, and the database team is making some changes, and they are questioning if they can meet the data activity monitoring requirement, just because there's going to be an additional fee with their new environment in regards to some licenses that they need to get. So they can also potentially build those requirements by doing compensating controls natively and building it on their own without those licenses. So really we're talking about the cost of the licenses that was too much of an expenditure at that time. So same scenario, right? The risk statement remains the same. The attack path changes a little bit. We're no longer talking about if it's going to be on the network or in the secure zone. We're just talking about, is there going to be data activity monitoring or not? Like I mentioned, everything remains the same. The only thing that changed in regards to the control is, are we going to actually leverage data activity monitoring or not? We run the numbers again, and it showed that there was a 30% probability of loss versus a vulnerability of 17.17%. With the DAM requirements, it showed again a significant decrease. In this particular case, it doesn't show here, but even that increase, that reduction, sorry, was bigger than the initial analysis, and that was because like I said, forward 4 to 5 months, and the actual number of PII data that was expected had increased. So now we had a lot more data that was being expected as part of the project, and that actually showed a bigger risk reduction than the original one. But again, so what did this was, we were able to show that if you just invest in that additional license, we stop spending time validating those compensating controls, because we need to ensure that all of them were actually in place, so that we were already spending time in resources, time implementing it, that it was a quick decision by the CIO and said, just go get the new license. Let's pay that, because at the end of the day, it is going to reduce our exposure, and let's stop wasting our time trying to build compensating controls that we're not sure we're going to be able to actually validate or not. So those are the two solid examples that we have used at the company where we have had good success in showing leadership team on the value of implementing all of our security controls and what would happen if some of those are not being met. And that concludes my presentation, Donna.
All right. Well, Hans, I did have a question for you. It sounds like you started a little further down the tree than Kurt did. Did you receive any questions or challenges on how you came up with your range estimates for your scenarios?
It's gotten better, right? Just because as we have been doing a significant number of analysis throughout the 2 or 3 years since we put the program together, we have, I'm gonna say, a solid repository of data, right? At the end of the day, there's always gonna be someone challenging it, but it's like, hey, do you remember the assessment we did, 5 months ago, and we all agreed on this number? So besides I'm gonna call this the executive summary presentation, we supported, yes, on the back end with a report that has all the data, where we got the data from. So it has definitely gotten better. At first, I think people were challenging the numbers. We're just using them so often now that I think everybody understands it.
Did you find that when you were actually getting the numbers that there was a big difference in the estimates from your subject matter experts? When I was taught FAIR analysis, you said if you have to interview folks, don't put them all in a room together is kind of the best practice, that you get people to separate and ask them independently. And if they're way off, then you kind of challenge each one and see if you can get them to work it out. Is that the process that you followed, or did everyone generally agree on your ranges when you were putting them together initially?
Yeah, no, so the approach that you're mentioning is pretty much what we do. So if we talk to the database team, is just a database team. We do not get together with the application support folks, right? But we always have different members of our security team to, at that time, kind of help drive those numbers in the sense of, did you think about this? Did you think about that? To help the database team kind of narrow down a little bit their numbers, right? And then separately, we do kind of a huddle between the security team, because even in that sense, I think initially within our security team, each one has, their expertise, their years of experience, and in some cases, each individually, our numbers were different. So what was nice about it is that collectively, we have agreed on a specific number or in a specific attack path and all the elements that lead to it.
All right. Well, I think we're about out of time. If your question was not answered in the chat, feel free to reach out to us. We're here as a resource for you. I just want to thank you both, Kurt and Hans, for a fantastic session and for your contributions to FairCon 2020. And hopefully we'll see you here next year. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Donna.
Thanks, Donna.
Thank you.